Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening with Pisa Presents and a night at the Roxbury Puddingstone. So, let us begin. Now, I'm not really sure if you've ever wondered about the rocks that underlie our major cities. Well, this here is Boston. Wonderful city, can highly recommend a visit. Now, beneath a fair portion of not only Boston but the surrounding area is the official rock of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which is the Roxbury Conglomerate, affectionately known by the much more adorable name as the Roxbury Puddingstone. Now, this right here is a conglomerate. Obviously, there you go, conglomerate. Now, it's a kind of sedimentary rock that's known for having large sized particles, like these right here, called clasts, alongside much smaller grains. Now, rounded clasts, like this one right here, means that these clasts traveled a distance to be part of the rock. So basically, if you think of them in a rock tumbler, they were tumbled and knocked about a lot on their journey. Now, in England, or even like, say, in Massachusetts, for example, in New England, they are sometimes called pudding stones after a British pudding, not say the American like instant rice pudding like this, for example, but think of a Dickensian Christmas pud with the raisins and all sorts of the other fruit and like the flaming brandy sauce and whatnot in them. So all the other little the goodness and the nuts and everything in it mimic the texture and the consistency of a conglomerate, hence the phrase pudding stones. Now, this right here is obviously Gondwana. Now, how does this get involved? Well, the Roxbury Conglomerate is about 595 to 570 million years old, and a record of those clasts mentioned before as well as volcanic rocks that are remnants of the late Proterozoic. So during this time, the breakup of Gondwana, now this whole below illustration being a lot better than whatever the heck this thing is here. The thing with getting your images from public sourcing is that sometimes you have to rely on stuff that's a bit sus, like that one right there. I saw that and I'm like, what the heck is that? So fortunately I have ones like this right here. Now, altogether, when all of this started rifting and breaking apart, this led to a lot of volcanism. So you get a lot of these volcanic rocks that are in not only the Roxbury Conglomerate or the Pudding Stone, whichever you really want to call it, but that these volcanic rocks are also kind of scattered throughout these parts of Massachusetts as well. Now, in terms of the class themselves, the parts that are of other sources, finding the ultimate source of many of these clasts is very difficult, understandably, because of, well, they're underneath the greater Boston metropolitan area. So it's kind of hard to be digging underneath there and figuring out what's going on. Now, this right here is Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was a poet that was active in the area, and he was the one that came up with the nickname. He wrote a poem where basically it was concerning giants that were throwing around the British version of the pudding. And so these rocks, there were so many of these rocks in the area that he kind of got the idea that the giants were throwing them around like puddings. And this poem kind of stuck. And so that's how people got to be calling them the Roxbury Puddingstones. And because it just kind of got on and one idea led to the other, it eventually was designated the official Commonwealth rock. Massachusetts is not really a state, it's a commonwealth like Pennsylvania, in 1983. Now, the rock was named for exposures in the Roxbury portion of Boston, which is right here. Now, which of itself, because of just like we just said, there is so much of this material present, was originally named Roxbury, spelled rocks like Rocks, and then berry. Now, all of this material underlies not only Boston, but nearly a dozen nearby suburbs as well. Now, while there's some contradiction and controversy as to which rock units comprise the Roxbury Conglomerate, most geologists place it as the lower part of the Boston Bay Group. It's usually defined as having three subunits. So you're looking at the Brookline member, the Dorchester member, and the Squantum member, which is this fellow right here. So it's a poorly sorted conglomerate, which means that it has a wide range of particles from fine sands to coarse cobbles. Now, the clasts are usually made of igneous or metamorphic rock, like your usual things like granite, quartzite, or rhyolite, and it can range greatly in color from gray to even pink. Now, the matrix variable consists of usually like a gray pink, arcosic sandstone to various other colors sometimes. Now, because this rock has been so really metamorphosed and squished back and forth, these subunits are really layered together, and you can't necessarily say that one stops at a certain point at which the other begins. Now, right here with this geologic map, the Roxbury Conglomerate is the tan, so you can kind of get a good idea of just really sort of where things are all together. Now, this right here, there's even more controversy about the rock's depositional environment. So, said earlier, the Boston Basin. So, if you think of basin, obviously a basin is just that, a basin. Now, for the longest time, people were thinking that these rocks were, well, transported by glacial action, and then the rock formed after and as they receded. How this happened, I respectively had no idea, as there's simply not enough time for that. So if you can kind of look on the left hand side there, the Laurentide Glacier was the last major one to impact this general area, and that receded by about 16 or 17,000 years ago, with all of Massachusetts being ice free by ballpark 11,700 years ago. There was not enough time for all of that to happen and form. Now, on the right, by the way, that's what's called a glacial erratic. That's just term for basically a very large boulder that as these glaciers are going by, they just kind of pluck this thing up and just leave it in a seemingly random spot. Like if you think the word erratic, or if you say a person is being erratic and they're acting randomly, that's just where the word comes from. But yes, so instead, we now know that the Boston Basin, where all these rocks were formed, was actually a deep marine basin, and the Roxbury Conglomerate itself was formed from a subaqueous mass flow and also some turbidity currents. Now, these right here, glaciers obviously did have a huge impact. These are, in fact, glacial potholes from the region. So these glaciers eroded the rocks, which gave it a very characteristic topography in the area. And every so often, in addition to those glacial erratics and other things, they'll expose some underlying really old volcanic rocks like Deadham granite and Metopen volcanic complex, or just two of several different kinds of volcanic rocks that you may find just randomly sticking up in parts of Massachusetts around here. Now, the Roxbury Conglomerate's metamorphosed nature has made it really a frequent subject for building stone. Obviously, also, too, because it's freaking everywhere, they had to do something with it. Now, unlike conglomerate, a lot of the time, because it's just so sandwiched in of itself, it made it very, very strong. It made it actually a pretty reliable building material, which a lot of conglomerates really aren't. It's also fairly moisture resistant, especially so compared to, again, other conglomerates. Now, it's very, very hard to dress though because it's so coarse. And so what people do instead is you cut it in very large blocks with exposed surfaces left to weather to this irony blackish brown with granite used for more refined corners. It's just easier to work. And so that is a technique called ashlar masonry. So you can see that right there. So you see the kind of like the rough surface left on the outside. Then on the right is rubble masonry. That is actually a still from a bunch of people. They're building a dam. It's actually the Civilian Conservation Corps. So basically, what they're doing is they're just using regular pieces of this rock and they're just using it to basically stack a dam together. Now, so many buildings were constructed with this rock that for a time it was actually also called church stone. And actually, over 35 churches, in fact, were built with it in the 19th to the earliest 20th centuries alone. Now, with it weathering to that classic irony brown black, it was a really popular choice for neo Gothic styles, which made it a huge hit during the Victorian period because, of course, people were all about that color during then. Now, not only churches, but you're looking at houses, hospitals, pubs, bell towers, cemeteries. On the left, right there, you're looking at the Cathedral of the Holy Cross. Now, down there in the lower right is the Memorial for the 20th Massachusetts Infantry in Gettysburg, all sorts of other buildings. So, altogether, wherever you look, the Roxbury Puddingstone is truly the rock that built Boston. So, thank you very much for joining us today, folks, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your week.